Oh, please be patient. The technical setbacks, like we were saying. Professor, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, the network may not be as good as it should be, but if you can hear me, that is good. Good evening.
Good evening, dear Professor. Thank you for being on this show with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak about this subject that has become so topical and so worrying for the continent and the world.
Good evening, dear Professor. Thank you very much. Yes, the world has been waiting for you. The world has been waiting to hear your voice. And we have seen that you already launched an official address 2 days ago. And today we are back again live with you. So the people are waiting to hear from you, Professor. Go ahead.
First, let me say how grateful I am for allowing me through this medium to share my thoughts, particularly with my kith and kin from the continent of Africa. I share my thoughts not as an expert, but as one who loves and worries about this continent. As we speak now, we have seen the ravages of COVID-19 in Asia, in Europe, in America, and in many African countries. We now know that a number of African countries have instituted several approaches to dealing with this virus. In South Africa, we know that there is a lockdown. In Uganda, there has been a lockdown. In Rwanda, there is a lockdown. In Kenya, we have dusk to dawn curfews. In Tanzania, they have adopted a different approach, which is almost comparable to the approach that has been adopted in Sweden. But the very first thing that I want to say is we are dealing with something that even medical scientists have never encountered before. And therefore, every measure that is being taken is largely trial and error, although at the foundation of it, there is some science. It is therefore important that we obey the prescriptions relating to hygiene. This is something that has changed our lives fundamentally, and I hold the view that each country ought to be obedient to the foundational scientific prescriptions, but it is also important to recognize that each country must adopt measures that are sensitive to the realities in those countries, and I'm talking about the socio-economic realities. I know in many African cities, almost 70% of the population live on what I'll describe as a daily economy. These are men and women who leave their houses in the morning and earn money and buy foodstuffs for the day. And therefore, when we talk about lockdown, we ought to ask ourselves, how will we deal with this population? Are African governments prepared to provide food for this population? Are they prepared to pay rent for this population? Are they prepared to pay school fees for this population? And then there is the middle class, those who by dint of their lifestyle have acquired houses on mortgages or offices on mortgages, which are payable monthly. There is no domestic commerce. There is no international commerce. Are African governments going to ensure that there is a moratorium for the next 3 months so that no mortgages are paid? Are we talking about, if we talk about sectors of the economy, let me speak about the tourism industry. In Kenya, which is my mother country, almost 60 to 70% of hotels are now closed.
which means that the workers have no meaningful engagement, which means that their incomes have gone down. That is true of Tanzania, that is true of Ghana, and I need not mention all these countries, so that the impact on the economy is of such a nature that Africans must be very reluctant to copy and paste some of the measures that are being taken in Europe and in the United States of America. If you permit me, for example, in the United States of America, where they have ordered lockdown in states such as New York and New Jersey, you will note that the federal government of the United States has injected $2 trillion United States dollars, which is just about the GDP of the entire Africa. In Germany, I think they may have put aside anything between 400 and 500 million euros. And many African countries are now going to the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other multilateral lending institutions. So without belaboring the issue, my message to my fellow African is that this is not a death sentence. The COVID-19 is not a death sentence. It is an occasion for we as Africans to reflect about our lives. It is an occasion for African countries to reflect how we run our economies. What portion of the budget do we give to our health sector? Do we give our military forces more money than we give to health? Do we give our public health sectors less money than we give to other non-productive sectors, which are merely in the arena of consumption? How do we deal with hygiene? Do we teach these basic things in schools? Do we have factories? We are now talking about masks, and we are waiting for Jack Ma from China to donate masks to us. And I thank Jack Ma. But have our bureaus of standardization determined that these masks meet certain thresholds? People are talking about testing vaccines, and we are very happy for the great scientific work that is going on in Europe and America, and I believe even underground in Africa. Is it not the occasion for African governments and African business people and African professionals to demand that in the area of research and development, we are always ahead of the game? So that there are many things that can be said, but I fear, without having the advantage of how inner governments work in Africa, that we may be copy-pasting practices that are being given pride of place in Europe and America without understanding the threat of social disorder that may be brought about by those who may say it rather contract coronavirus than die of starvation. And I've heard people saying that. We look at India. We have seen what has happened in India with the lockdown, and we have seen the commentary that is going around. Yes. Permit me to say that I'm not pretending to be an expert. I'm not being prescriptive. I'm merely flagging out what I consider to be critical issues that ought to be taken into consideration by our governments. It is noteworthy that in many African countries, the brutality of the so-called disciplined forces has been manifested, which also calls into question, how do we train our men and women in uniform? Some have said cynically that a lot more people have died in Africa out of police brutality rather than out of coronavirus.
That's true.
Those are worrying statements. Let me pause for a moment, if only to invite a question for clarification.
Thank you very much, Professor. I mean, that has been exactly what the people of the Africans in the diaspora have been aching and have been waiting. Like, How would Africa use this as a learning board? How would African doctors get awakened? How would the health sector bounce back? Is it real that the virus is even killing, or it is hunger, or it is malaria, or it is other injections that we have on the continent already? So we are very grateful, and the diaspora has been asking a lot of questions to you, Professor. And we sent those questions to you. I don't know if you could just go through the questions that we already sent to you and just pick it up and respond. Like there was a question from a diasporan lady who said, Professor, what is your opinion about the situation of these new viruses that are going to be injected on our people? What do you hold as an opinion of why they must test it only on the people of Africa?
I think that is a very valid, and it would be useful for this conversation to be useful for those who don't have the question, for you to read out the question, then I answer as you raised question number one. The first thing that I must say is that the social media is now awash with information. And somebody has rightly said that part of the problem we have with this virus is what she has rightly described as infodemics, and in itself is a pandemic of too much information, most of which really are just rumors that are being given pride of place. But the truth be told, I've seen a conversation purportedly between two French doctors where they are saying that if there is a vaccine, then it ought to be tested in Africa. If it is true that they have said that, is something that we ought to condemn. But the truth be told, Africa must not also wait to be a consumer of things that are made outside of Africa. I know for a fact that under the aegis of the African Union, we have established 5 centers for disease control, located in East Africa, in Southern Africa, Central Africa, Northern Africa, and Western Africa. I know that there are universities and institutions that are involved in research in the area of public health. It is critical that at this stage, there ought to be a coordination of efforts so that African professionals in the area of research can also be thinking about a vaccine that would be utilized in the continent of Africa, a vaccine that will have been tested within the continent of Africa, and this is achievable. And permit me to say, this is where the diaspora can come in.
Yes.
Some of our best men and women live outside of the continent of Africa. Some of our best men and women in the area of medicine will be found in Europe. They'll be found in the United States of America. They'll be found in Australia. We must find a way where all these efforts are coordinated. And one can say that there are a number of ways of coordinating these efforts. Under SADC, I am quite certain that there is a mechanism that can bring together the professionals within SADC. The same can be done within the East African community, the same within Central Africa, West Africa, and the Maghreb. And under the umbrella of the African Union, these individuals can then be facilitated through serious funding for purposes of beginning to look at vaccines that will help us, not only because of COVID-19. In my view, COVID-19 is merely a wake-up call. I've been having a conversation just this evening with a friend of mine who is involved in the area of medical health, a lady called Tausi, who lives in the United States of America and is in Tanzania, and is involved in the area of child survival, maternal health care, and that area. And people are doing great things in different parts of the world. Coordination. and the diaspora, and I belong to a number of groups that include men and women in the diaspora. The first question that we must ask, how can we coordinate this? I know in one group, a petition is already being signed for purposes of transmission to the chairman of the AU Council with a view to animating the African Union not to rest on her laurels, but to provide leadership and to convene African ministers for health. African ministers for health are now just in the business of reading daily the mortality and morbidity prevalence. We should do more than simply telling us the morbidity and mortality prevalence and go into the arena of dealing with real issues.